rather than just a singular event. And thanks for, it's not just me doing this, there's a whole team of fifth years who have helped and produced this over the summer, so just thanks for them helping to make this happen as well. And also thanks for the speakers for taking their time to come here. I mean, first of all, I'm just going to apologise, so Grania Hassett is unable to make it today in the end, but I think the idea of women in and practice is a topic that will come up amongst the speakers' presentations today, but also amongst the discussion at the end. I'm going to just quickly speak about where this came from. I was at Christmas walking to work and I was listening to a BBC podcast, and I can't remember who she was or what she was speaking about, but she said history is his story, and it just struck me like I walked into a wall that etymologically the word history means the story of the wise old man, and I just couldn't believe it. I was just so shocked by just the idea that some of the sort of most insidious but banal and the most hidden things in that sort of structure, the sort of culturification of our society, and I just wanted to do something about it. And that actually coincided with the weekend before I started my second term and the day that women marched against Trump. And I then decided that something had to be done in UCD about it, just because I wanted to start a conversation. And this is the outcome of a whole term of conversation amongst students and staff, and so this is about starting a conversation. I want to just raise awareness amongst the students, and it's something maybe we presume that is in existence, equality, but it's something actually that you need to be aware of in order to act upon. So this is just about opening the issues in a sort of open, generous forum. So before I sort of explain what I mean by forum, I'm just going to say what the setup is about today. So we've got quite a few speakers here, and as you can see, I've sort of arranged the topic and broken it down. So we've got women in education, women in industry, women in the city, and women in history. So these sort of extrapolating spaces, these institutionalized spaces that should be critiqued and their stability contested. So what do I mean by a forum? So I use the word forum very specifically because I'm hoping the architects in the room will be sort of, Roman forum. It's a genuinely open civic place to discuss civic things. And I mean that. I want people to exchange their ideas and not just take on what is being said. I want you to develop a sort of critical stance. And so lastly, the idea of multitude. So this is not a lecture. It's not a one-way dialogue. There is no single expert or empty vessel. There are 4 speakers, 1 chair, a number of special guests in the room, and a room full of students and staff. And I want them to sort of all talk together for the next hour and a half about this topic. So, because of that, let's start.
Hi, I'm Sheila, for those of you who don't know me. I have been teaching here in the school for very many years, since about 1980, and also I am a partner in O'Donnell and Tuomey, a practice in Dublin. Thanks to Chloe for organising this event. I mean, as she said, grew out of various moments in her life, but certainly I think all of us in this building, in this group of buildings, have noticed across the last year the little provocative images that Chloe has been sticking up on the walls under the title Herstory, which apparently she didn't know about Melanie's group when she was doing that, just showing us images of work by women architects and designers and asking us to stop and think. I mean, I think it was probably also partly inspired by an event here last year where a number of architects who teach in the school or who are involved in the school in different ways, of a generation younger than mine, presented really interesting work they were doing on international stages in the Chicago Triennale and other exhibitions. And in the discussion afterwards, it was noted, in fact I think I noted, that of all the architects who presented, there was only 2 women's names that came up. And it struck me as being something we should stop and think about, because in my generation, when we set up Group 91 in 1991, a conglomeration of 8 architectural practices, of 13 directors, 6 were women, which is almost 50-50. And five of those practices would be identified as being either all women or equal men and women. So it made me pause and wonder, is this just a sort of little arithmetic blip, or is there a reason why the younger generation seems to have fewer prominent women? I mean, I hope that this will be a positive event, and I would hope it would encourage our students to believe that there is a really good career for women in architecture, which I believe there is. But I think maybe it's also a start of trying to identify maybe some of the hurdles and challenges that women face in the profession, and thinking about how we can help people among ourselves to overcome those. So I'm going to first of all introduce the four speakers. Each of them will speak for about 10 minutes. Tara Kennedy, who's going to talk about women in education as a graduate of this school. And while she was here, she formed an interdisciplinary design studio with Joanne Butler called Culturstruction. And they are very much known for their involvement in the Commonage project, which is very important and very prominent. Part of their polemic type of practice that Tara works in was to do with the process of designing and making environments. And they invited artists and architects to look at the theme of community in contemporary rural Ireland. Currently, Tara is practicing as an architect with John McLaughlin Architects, and she also teaches in the Cork Centre for Architectural Education, so she's going to talk about education today. Carole Pollard, Women in Industry. I mean, Carole is the current president of the RIAI, one of a number of women presidents in recent years, which is also significant. And so she's perfectly placed to talk about the Irish architectural profession today. She has worked in almost all aspects of architecture. She's been a sole practitioner and the director of her own practice over her career. Which she set up 4 years after graduating. As well as practicing, she also undertook a master's in the history of design and material culture, where her skills in research and writing have led to a number of publications in recent years. Mary McAuliffe is going to talk about women in the city. Mary is a well-known and respected name in discussion about women in Irish history. She gained her PhD at Trinity and has since gone on to focus her research interests on the contribution of women to Irish history as assistant professor and lecturer in gender studies here at UCD. She was president of the Women's History Association of Ireland between 2011 and 2014, and she continues to be an active committee member. More recently, she's been involved in publications to commemorate the 1916 centenary, including Richmond Barracks 1916, We Were There, 75 Women of the Horizon. And finally, Melanie Lynch will talk about women in history. Melanie is the founder and director of Herstory Dublin, which strives to tell the lost stories of historical, contemporary and mythological women in Irish culture. Before starting Herstory, Melanie worked in some of the most prestigious advertising agencies, producing award-winning campaigns for charities such as Bernardo's. Her story is driven by the amnesia of women's stories from the everyday Irish consciousness, and seeks to discover the stories of over 1,000 remarkable women included in Irish Dictionary of National Biography and bring them to public attention. So, if we could start by welcoming Tara Kennedy.
Thank you. And first, I'd just like to say how really wonderful it was to be asked to present at something like this, and something that was organised by students and from within the student base in the college. And I think that really resonates with some of the things that maybe I'm going to talk about. As Sheila mentioned, I am a graduate of UCD architecture, and then also I now teach in Cork Centre for Architectural Education, and I'm going to talk from the point of view of being a student and then also working within education. And I suppose because when I started studying architecture, it was a second degree to me, and I had previously studied fine art. I'd studied at NCAD. It was something that I was quite aware of during my studies, what the kind of structure of architectural education was, how I found that very different from the structure of art education, and the things that I thought were maybe I suppose, systemic things that could do with questioning within the system of studying architecture. So I think of education as a process of rethinking, reimagining and questioning, and so what we're doing today here is part of that, but the idea that education is always about questioning. I also thought a lot while studying architecture and I suppose subsequently about the idea of kind of self-perpetuating structures. So within the culture of architecture you have this idea that you must be able to work all night, you must be able to do an all-nighter. Not here, but in a lot of schools, that studios are open right through the night. So this is a kind of a take on this by a student called Sleep Suit, and the idea of how you might stay in the studio through the night. And this as being a kind of atmosphere of studying architecture. So this is a kind of structure while I was studying architecture I thought of as being something that required questioning because it's just a self-perpetuating structure. There's no reason that people have to work like this. It's because people do it, they continue to do it. And at the time I thought that was just kind of something that was frustrating in terms of structuring your time as a student and having come from something that really didn't operate like that. And so this is kind of some points from a recent discussion on the idea of the all-nighter from Art Daily. So these are this was a discussion on the pluses and minuses or for or against it. And I thought these were interesting just to look at. So the idea that our time lacks so much value that we give up our sleep, health and personal life just to perform our artistry is not only destructive personally but damaging to the profession as a whole. Yes, it's a strain on the health and well-being of students, but helps in preparing us for the pressure of the workplace. I think the culture needs to be changed for the health of the profession. Holding up all-nighters on a pedestal as if it's the only way to produce work teaches us as architecture students not to value our time. It's probably why we're underpaid as a profession, from having no sense of how valuable those hours were that we were giving up. So I suppose what I wanted to do was then begin to connect these things to what I think about women in architecture, women in the profession, and connecting them to women in education. So at the time I thought there were systemic things that needed to be questioned, but later I began to think about them as systemic things about a patriarchal structure that maybe need to be questioned. So hand in hand with this idea that you do all-nighters is an idea that all of your time is given over to architecture and you don't kind of schedule other things and you're expected to be in the studio all of the time. And this then does translate into the way that the profession is structured and an idea that people are expected to work different types of hours and to be available different types of hours. And so this then began to be something that I connected to the idea of women in architecture. So this is an image of a woman called Tara Darrington, who's a theatre maker, and she is one of the founders of a movement called MAM, Mothers, Artists, Makers, that kind of came out of the Waking the Feminists movement, which maybe people are familiar with. There was a movement in theatre over the recent years. And so this is a sign that she brought to the first Waking the Feminists event, which was held at a time, I think it was maybe 2 o'clock or thereabouts, and she had this sign that said, "Where are the disappeared women of the arts? At the school gates now." So this idea that it's to do with scheduling and time and how people respect their time, and that's something that really is something that's an important issue for women, that begins with this structure or this kind of system of how you manage your time in education. And following on from this, then this is some statistical information from the Architects Journal Women in Architecture surveys over recent years. And then with kind of shocking statistics that in a 2016 survey, to 90% of women in the UK felt that it was a disadvantage to their career to have children. Only 1/3 of the female architects who responded had children, and 9 out of 10 said they were expected at some point to work nights or at weekends. So it's not, not to talk about people's decisions whether or not to have a family, but just that these are systemic things and it can be connected to the way that the education structure works. It's this idea of self-perpetuating structures. Another one of these kind of things that frustrated me while studying was access to being able to get involved in making things. And this was something that in part was addressed by some of the work that Sheila mentioned to do with self-initiating projects and setting up projects such as this one based in Callan and Kilkenny called Commonage, which involved a series of design and make summer schools. And I suppose thinking about the fact that as architecture students, but particularly as female architecture students, your access to actually getting involved in building experience, construction experience is really very limited. It's a little bit easier for people who are male architecture students to maybe go during the summer and get a work on a construction site or something like that. But as a female studying architecture, it's difficult to get involved in those kinds of projects, and that's something that's a kind of systemic thing. Then also to think about this in terms of the idea of inherited systems, the idea of a patriarchal system as an inherited system. So kind of slightly moving into things that are to do with teaching architecture, but I think I would have a kind of non-hierarchical view about these things translating into one another. So the things I'm thinking about in relation to being a student and in relation to teaching are all connected. So this is a blog that's just been set up this year by an academic in the Royal College of Art, and she is trying to highlight the issue of women who write about architecture and how it becomes a kind of self-perpetuating structure again, that the women who write about architecture are not those that are taught. So she's saying that each academic year students are issued reading lists largely dominated by male voices, leading them to then assume that these are the voices of authority. But that she's seeking to address this by putting together lists and putting together a resource of all the women that write about architecture. So this is something that's a student issue. It's also an issue from working within academia, because there's a structure within academia that your work needs to be published and peer reviewed and all these things in order for your career to progress. So it's directly linked to the fact that women maybe don't progress into as senior roles. Because they don't become the dominant voices. Then there's the issue of, I suppose, student bias, which is one that often gets talked about. Now this is an evaluation form in which a student evaluates a female lecturer quite highly and says she's great, but she's female. I prefer males, which, you know, this is. We can laugh at this, but in actual fact, there is hard fact and research emerging on the fact that there's an unconscious bias in both male and female students towards female lecturers and female academics. So this is something that just came out last week in The Economist, but there was research that said that in a kind of an anonymous survey, people would rate things like handouts, which have been given by the exact same handout given by a male and a female lecturer, and they would rate them less highly given by a female lecturer. So it's and it was across the board in male and female students. Also, and so I suppose this is also then connected to this idea of how where people progress to within the career within education. So since the establishment of the first Irish university over 400 years ago, a woman has never occupied the most senior role possible. There's never been a woman president of any of the universities. And this I've just put with an image of, this is a Twitter feed that called Academic Manel Watch that kind of, this is you. So maybe you're going to talk about this then, Mary. So this is highlighting this issue of the dominance of all male panels and calling this up everything like that. So this is just an image from a piece that Joanne and I made a number of years ago, but this was kind of thinking about this idea of inherited systems and inherited structures that are closed and how we can begin to break and talk about those. So to finish just again on this point of education as a process of rethinking, reimagining and questioning. Also, sorry, I just wanted to say I'm going to have to leave probably before the discussion starts because I have to pick up my daughter. So in case I walk out, it's not because I'm not really interested in being part of the discussion. It's for a connected reason.
Thanks very much, Tara. That was really a great presentation. I'll call on Carole Pollard now as our next.
Thanks, Sheila. Thank you, Tara, for that. I just want to endorse what Tara says about valuing your time. And I'd just like to slightly adjust that, and I think it's about respecting your time also, and respecting your intellect. And I don't think women in particular are very good at that. I think our lives are compartmentalised into so many different areas that we do forget that we have this wonderful intellect. And despite what that awful person wrote in their form, being a woman lecturer in DIT, I think women are great at that, and we need more of it. Anyway, I'm here to talk about women in the industry primarily from my role as president of the RIAI, which is the professional body in Ireland for architects. And because Gráinne Hassett is not here to speak about practice, I'll just throw in a few little ideas about practice as well. So the RIAI is your professional body. The RIBA is a British professional body. The RIAI is the Irish professional body for architects. And we are the Register for Architects in Ireland. And we are pretty much exactly the same age as the RIBA, in that we were founded 178 years ago in 1838, and the RIBA was founded 2 years earlier. The sad part about that is that the first woman member of the RIAI was not until 1944, which is 105 years after its foundation. The RIBA did slightly better in that they had their first woman member in 1888, 50 years after their foundation, so they got there before us. Right now, we're more aligned. They have had 3 female presidents, and the RIAI has had 3 female presidents. Joan O'Connor was president in the 1990s, Michelle Fagan was president in 12-13, and now me. And then just about, to go back to Tara's point about women in positions of seniority within the schools of architecture, I'm very pleased to say that DIT School of Architecture, Orna Hanley is the head of school there. And in Waterford, Maura Henry was the head of school in WIT for a number of years. So women architects are rising to the top within education. I do believe that, and I do think that we'll see more of that as time goes on. And just to go back to the RIAI for a moment and the historical context of it, when I was writing my piece for Architecture Ireland in January of this year, 2017, I thought I'd look back in the old yearbooks to see what the President was talking about in 1917. I thought that might be interesting to try and do that. So the President then was a man called William K. Parry, and I thought this was quite amusing, I suppose, in that his address to the membership then, he addresses his brothers, because they're the RIAI members essentially, his fellow gentlemen architects, the King, War and God. In that order. So you can see women weren't even on the horizon. But I suppose that is due to the fact that women didn't even have the vote in 1917. We didn't get the vote in Ireland until 1918, and at that stage you had to be married and you had to be over the age of 30 in order to exercise that vote. So we have come a long way. But I think it's also very indicative of the political colour of the RIAI back 100 years ago, in that 1916 Easter Rising isn't even mentioned, and we all know the devastation that wrought on our city, particularly in Dublin, and you would have thought there was opportunities there for architects, but they obviously had it all sewn up amongst each other, so that wasn't needed to be mentioned. Anyway, the membership of the RIAI, again, like the RIBA, the female membership of the RIAI is not something that I'm very proud of. It currently stands at 25% of the total membership is women. That's better than it is in Europe. And I was speaking to Kathleen James Chakraborty beforehand, and I know she has some more statistics on this, but my understanding that is the European-wide statistic is 22% women, so we're slightly better in Ireland, and it's comparable with the UK. I'm optimistic in that the highest percentage of women members in any of our membership categories is in the graduate category. We have 59% of our graduate members are women, and 35% of our student membership is women. So that's a good sign. But it's going to need an awful lot of work and an awful lot of, events like this, I think, to make sure that carries through, because in our retired membership category, only 5% are women. And the tragedy of that is all of you young women or young architects in this room, you may think, oh well, that's because there were no architects back then. But in actual fact, women in the age of 60, 65 now, when they were in college studying architecture, it was 40% probably of their class in any 1 year were women, and only 5% have made it to retirement. And that's because women are not being retained in the industry. And that is the real tragedy of our profession. And that's what we need to address. I know how difficult it has been for me to stay in the profession. And there have been times when I have wanted to throw my hat in. And in fact I have. But I've come back again and again. And I have to say that membership of the RIAI, and I know this sounds like a real plug because I'm president and why wouldn't I say this, but membership of the RIAI has been the reason that I am still an architect. Because in 1992, when I essentially lost my job because I was pregnant, I got involved with a couple of colleagues and we set up the Small Practice Forum. And through the Small Practice Forum, I built a network of architects who were struggling in small practice. And we were sounding boards for each other, and we supported each other, and we kept going. And that has now evolved into the Dublin Forum, and it still exists. And it's an online platform, and they also have meetings, and it's a really good way. And I've been really trying to encourage the setting up of regional networks around the country as well, because in regional parts, in rural parts of rural Ireland, if you're working in sole practice, it's very hard sometimes to stay in practice. It's a very complex thing, architecture. And you really need that support. So that's one of the reasons. Another thing that I got involved in the early 2000s was having worked part-time since 1992, and working part-time for me has been anything between 10 and 100 hours a week, I have to say, but I have worked part-time since 92. And I had friends who, at that stage, we would have, in the early 2000s, me and my friends from college, we all would have had, kids and trying to juggle family and working. And I knew a lot of people wanted to work part-time, but there wasn't really a way of knowing how to do that. So we set up a network called, very imaginatively called, the Part-Time and Flexi-Time Workers Network in the RIAI. And we got together and we used to have lunchtime meetings, and you could just pop in, have a sandwich, have a chat. And that culminated with us producing an information leaflet about your rights as an part-time employee, and also, kind of how to negotiate your position within practice, in terms of don't just want to work 5 mornings a week, and all the practical things about doing that. And it was received quite well by the employers. So that's another initiative that kind of died because all of us who all these things are organic and they keep growing and turning, and we need new people coming in and taking them over. And what Chloe is doing now is great and doing this, and we need to keep rolling it on and rolling it on. You can't, just think, oh, that's done and that stops. It has to keep evolving. So that is what I would say to you is that not all of you are going to have all great, wonderful, successful careers like Shelley McNamara, Vaughan Farrell, Sheila O'Donnell, and all these hugely, hugely influential and important women architects within our profession. A lot more of you are going to be like me, and you're going to struggle, and you're going to work on your own, and you're going to go into practice, and you're going to come out, and you have to go to find another path, and you're going to go this way, and you're going to go that way. And that's not to say that it's not enjoyable and it's not rewarding. Of course it is. But I'm hoping that you're going to earn more money than I've earned in my lifetime. I really hope that, because that comes back to what Tara is saying. I've been really trying to push the Sustainable Careers in Architecture platform during my presidency, and it shocks me how little we get paid, particularly at the graduate level and as young architects, and that has to change. And I would, if I had been the primary breadwinner in my household, I would have made sure my husband would have had the flexi hours in terms of minding our children, but I never ever got to a position, and a lot of women architects never get to a position where they will earn more than their partners, because architects aren't paid that well, really, and we've got to change that. And I don't know if you saw, but we produced a new RIAI employment policy just in the last few weeks, and we have standard contracts now for architects, including graduate contracts, and I do believe that is going in the right direction, and that is not a way of punishing employers. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to get our fees up and our salaries up, as well as our status up, and we just want them to be paid properly for the service that we do. So in terms of practice, just to go back to that for a minute, I mentioned earlier on about the wonderful practices, award-winning practices that we have in Ireland, and we're really lucky at those. And I think it is phenomenal that Group 91 was so representative of the profile of the profession, and you know, that is really to be commended. And the fact that they are still successful tells its own story. But the fact of the matter is if you look at the 5 or 6 biggest practices in Ireland at the moment, only one of them, to my best of my knowledge, has a woman partner. And between them, you're saying they're employing probably at the moment, each of those 5 practices employing between 150, 200 people. You're talking about about 1,000 people, perhaps. Maybe I'm being a little bit ambitious in terms of working in large practice in Ireland, and you think there might only be one female partner amongst that whole cohort. It's in everything you look at. I'm sure Mary and Melanie will talk more about that. It's everywhere. But it is all about that story that even though you qualify as an architect and you come out gung-ho with enthusiasm and a huge abounding talent, to actually stay in the profession takes a huge amount of tenacity, and it also takes support. So so practice. I'm not going to really go into an awful lot of practice other than say that there was no typical practice. That's the only, I don't know if some of you made me hear when I spoke at the Emmett's series, where he invited different people in to talk about their practice, and that is, be open to that. At that seminar when I spoke, I showed a slide of my graduating group from DIT, and there was 24 in the photograph, 8 of whom were women, and I had just showed their silhouettes and of what they're all at. So the 8 women who graduated in my class in DIT, 2 are in local authority, 3 are sole practitioners like myself, and the other 2 don't practice. And if you look at the men in the photograph of the 16 men, only 1 doesn't practice architect, none are in local authority, and only 1 is in small.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm delighted to be here in a part of UCD I've never actually been in. So it's been an interesting exploration for me today, the architecture of UCD. I realise you can't see the Newman building from here, so I feel like I'm somewhere else entirely. I'm a historian, and I'm a historian of women, and particularly a historian of the trauma histories of women. And I have been thinking recently quite a lot about architecture and how architecture operated in creating spaces in which female bodies were placed for Ireland in the 19th and into the 20th century. And the last one closes in 1996, the one on Sean McDermott Street, which was Gloucester Street. And what is interesting about these spaces in terms of the city is that if you look at the Ordnance Survey map of 1936 of Sean McDermott Street, you see it's right in the middle of a very inhabited, busy area of the city. It's in the area known as the Monto, actually, which is Montgomery Street off O'Connell Street in the North Inner City. And these spaces were not hidden. They were not hidden away, so how do we not know these histories when they were standing right there in front of us? This is Sean McDermott Street, Magdalene Laundry today. And I suppose my question to you as architectural students, but also to those who might be interested in architectural history, is how these structures were created. Were they created to keep people out or to keep people in, or both? To construct the known knowns or the known unknowns, to paraphrase an American politician. These structures in the middle of busy cities are about confining inconvenient bodies, particularly inconvenient female bodies within these structures, keeping them there for life. The women who were within these institutions were known as penitents. This was a culture of containment, and architecture plays a large part in that. Archbishop Browne in Galway in the late 1950s fancied himself an architect, and he designed the Magdalene Laundry in Galway. And if you look at the redesigns, it wasn't put into fruition because at that stage the Magdalene Laundries began to close down, mainly because of economic conditions. People didn't need laundries anymore because technology, washing machines were coming into vogue. But he recreated the Magdalene Laundry in a more severe institutional style. Doors that could be locked from the outside but could not be opened from the inside. So this architecture of confinement is not just ideological, it is also the physical presence of these buildings on our city streets. And if we look again at, this is the area of the Monto this was in, so this was a very, very busy area. This is St. Mary's Asylum in Drumcondra, Hyde Park, Magdalene. Again, it's in the middle of a very leafy suburb on the north inner city. And they published a little leaflet on its anniversary in 1953, and its 100th anniversary. And they talked about their Magdalene women singing the praises of Our Lady of St. Mary's Refuge. And again, you see the similar architectural style. And again, I would ask you as students, is this about keeping out or letting in, keeping women in and keeping the public out? And how does that play into our knowledge of our histories? Because I think we can't look at these as just historic buildings. We have to see them as part and parcel of an ongoing system of institutionalization that uses architecture to elide the histories and the stories and the lives that are going on there. You could say that in today's system of direct provision, architecture is used to make it seem less offensive and less awful than it is, because most of the men, women and children who are kept in the direct provision system are in hotels that have been abandoned by NAMA. They're in B&Bs. They're in innocuous buildings that don't seem to suggest what they're actually serving, what they're actually doing. They're spaces of incarceration where people are confined under curfew. A very interesting photographic archive online is called the Asylum Archive, and it's a young man who spent some time in the direct provision system and is now not in that anymore. And he's gone around the country documenting all of the direct provision spaces in which he spent time, and also the ones that he knew about. And if you go on to that archive, you see ordinary bungalows, ordinary guest houses and B&Bs throughout the country, hotels within cities. All of these spaces of architecture not indicating at all the service that they were providing, which was about confining, again, inconvenient bodies. So I think if we don't learn from this architectural history we have of confining bodies we don't care about, poor people, unmarried mothers, young children in industrial schools, that we will continue to enact that type of confinement within spaces, that placement of bodies that are considered superfluous to need within societies. This is Hyde Park in Drumcondra after the fire. This is St. Mary's on Stanhope Street. I pass this every single day. I live in Stoneybatter. It is a secondary school and a primary school now, but because of my knowledge of its previous function, it was also a Magdalene Laundry. So every day when I pass it, I look at that and I think, behind those walls, behind those windows, many, many young girls and women, right down to the 1960s and 70s, were confined, some of them for the majority of their lives, some of them for all of their lives. So we have to ask questions of how the city was structured around gender, of how we understand our histories through looking at our architecture. This is an image that always speaks starkly to me. It is the Magdalene women from St. Sean McDermott Street, Magdalene, being paraded down in the 1950s on a May Day parade. And again, it indicates the known. People did know what went on behind those high walls. Like we know what goes on in direct provision. Like we know what goes on in the hotels that are used as homeless shelters today. But using these innocuous buildings, we can sort of make the issues in our society invisible. And I think we need to ask questions of that. Why are we doing that? I think we need to mark the city. One of the big campaigns that I was involved in 2013 was to get the new Rosie Hackett bridge named, or the new bridge named after Rosie Hackett, which was very, very successful. I was also involved in a campaign, last year in the exhibition of the 77 women in Richmond Barracks, and that's a very interesting revisioning of a male space, a barracks, which had been constructed in the mid-19th century, in which you had regiments of soldiers for many generations, in which the rebels of 1916, the majority of them men, were confined, only of 77 women were confined there. It has now become a space in which women's histories, women's hidden histories, are being commemorated and celebrated, and it is becoming a much more open space. I would recommend that any of you go and visit it. I think the architects who redesigned Richmond Barracks as a heritage site have done an absolutely wonderful job in opening up that space and allowing us in to gain knowledge of our hidden histories. I think also calling the bridge after Rosie Hackett has allowed us mark those spaces. The research I'm undertaking at the moment is looking at the experience of women during the War of Independence and Civil War, of violence on them. And many of the spaces in which the violence was committed on Irish women during this period, 1919 to 1923, was in their homes, in their domestic space. And how do we commemorate that as we go through our decade of commemorations? Because we don't mark cottages and tenement buildings with those histories. And I think we need to really look at how we do our architectural history. One great project that's happening in a moment, of course, is the Tenement Museum in Henrietta Street, bringing those histories from the ground up, the bottom up, back to life. Because it's in those spaces that the non-powerful have their histories, and those histories we need to know as well. So I suppose today, when Chloe asked me to speak about that, I thought a lot about what I would say. And I think for me, not being an architectural expert, but looking at buildings, because buildings are very important to me. It's where a lot of what I study happens, particularly for women, because women are confined to buildings for most of their lives, to the domestic, to institutions, to various spaces like that. So oftentimes I'm looking at these and how the city works, and how domestic spaces work, and how they're laid out both to confine and to control women for the most part. And I think it's a very interesting question that we need to ask ourselves, but you as architects and architectural students also need to ask yourself, do we still do that? Are we still creating those spaces that are actually gendered in ways that have been dictated to us by our histories? So in understanding our histories and how history and architecture interacts, I think maybe we will come to some conclusions about that. And I would also echo the fact that we need more women in all of these professions. We need more women staying in these professions. And I would say to all of you, please go on to Mammal Watch on Twitter and recognise that we can't have mammals either. We need more women talking about all these things. Thank you very much.
Mary, that was absolutely fascinating. It's always terrifying. Well, it's my first time actually ever following Mary, so she's one of the great historians in Ireland and a huge champion of feminism. We're very lucky to have her. Just a note on the Madeline Laundry is actually my most harrowing experience in starting Herstory was a tour I was given by a psychologist working with survivors in the Waterford Madeline Laundries, and there are no words to describe what those women went through. It was an extraordinary experience. But it's very important that we raise the profile of their stories and what they went through. Sorry, I'm just trying to find my arrangement. Ah, there it is. Oh, great. Okay, great. Here we go. How do I get it in? brilliant, thanks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a background and how Herstory started, and then I'm going to talk about Illuminate Herstory, a new light projection festival. Ireland already lights up the world on St. Patrick's Day in green, so I thought, why not light up the world with women? And the idea is gathering huge momentum. It's also a very powerful way of bringing women out of the shadows into the light and to celebrate and to acknowledge our struggles that have been very much in the darkness, but also to celebrate our achievements too. So here we go. So growing up in Ireland, I'm going to talk first a little bit about my personal history. In our household, there was no question that women were equal at all. My great-grandfather was a dairyman, loads of great feminists from Northern Ireland. And my grandmother, his daughter, went on to keep her career when she got married. She was the second in line to do that. I'm from a line of very formidable women in Northern Ireland, particularly in the Fermanagh area and the north. So there was no question about it, women were equal. Then I went to school and I discovered that there were only 5 women in the Irish history book, so I didn't do history for the leaving, so I wasn't very impressed, to be honest. And then for me going on then, gender was so personal and so painful, I think I didn't want to go there for my my degree thesis, so I chose racism and neo-racism and deconstructing racism, but gender caught up with me, and I discovered all these incredible women's stories. I presented to the Trinity history students, and I'd made a discovery from talking to the Royal Irish Academy that there are already over 1,000 extraordinary Irish women's biographies just sitting there gathering dust. There's loads of names missing. It doesn't include the Irish diaspora. This is a global phenomenon, the amnesia of women's stories. And the students in Trinity, the history students, weren't aware that this resource is there. Just to give you an indication of how women have been erased, but we know the stories are there. The women are absolutely incredible. And these stories, so many, like Countess Markievicz, just multifaceted, incredible role models from our history. So I decided to start Herstory as a cultural movement, a storytelling movement, to take a very democratic approach. My background is in advertising, communications. It's important. The stories belong to everybody. We have to make them accessible. And it started off as historical, now we're including contemporary and mythological. And if you look at contemporary culture, now we have celebrity culture, popular culture playing the censor, acting as the censor and determining whose stories are worthy of our attention, So a lot of nonsense that needs to be cracked open because it leads to the further dilution of women's representation. So I suppose I looked at the history books and how it's taught in school, and you can see how we got to Trump and Brexit and the brink of World War III. When you normalise world wars, genocide, you condition young people to expect this. We're almost not surprised that it's happened. But what happens if you go back through history and you start to fill in all the women's stories, all the missing narratives? You actually rewrite the future. By shifting the balance, by representing women, by empowering women, we will shift the future, ultimately. So the objective is to change stereotypes and change how women's stories are told. And I suppose it's based on that insight from talking to Women Are Boring. The 2 founders also have a communications background. In Ireland, and this is an international problem too, we have incredible academic resources, brilliant academics, great research, but what gets diluted down to popular culture, what gets into the mainstream, is just shocking, especially when it comes to women's representation. So we need to work together with the academic community to bring women's representation, intelligent, brilliant women's representation into the light. But it has to be storytelling for everybody. This is important. So the aims are that Ireland will inspire the world to celebrate women, because we're a small country with a huge heart, and people do listen to us and we do talk. And to spark an egalitarian storytelling style as well. I'll talk more on that in a minute. And then to develop a model that can be adapted worldwide. In particular, the education programme. I'm looking at a model I worked on in Kenya, the 4 Generations Project, where within 4 years the local tribes in Kenya would lose all of their tribal heritage, their stories, their histories, their knowledge of nature, because compulsory education had been introduced into the system, so they weren't recording their stories, nothing ever recorded, written down. So they devised an education program whereby the children sat down with the elders every week and they recorded the stories and the knowledge, and then, this is genius, then they got the children to write the future of their tribe. So they had to sit down and analyse the process. Okay, so what do we want to keep, what do we want to say goodbye to, what do we need to improve on? So they learned an awareness and respect for their heritage. They learned respect for their elders, very, very important. And also they learned how to write their own future, to feel engaged in that process. And then because the director of the project was also a theatre director, the children brought the stories to life through theatre and through art. So we're looking at this model, but to do it through the national pages, to do it in mass scale, to get the children to rewrite the future, especially when it comes to talking about women's stories. So at the moment there's 2 TV series in the pipeline. There's a documentary series at RTE, it's on the early stages of development. Slow burner and I'm really afraid to say this now, but an animation series, that's the plan for children. Challenging gender stereotyping before the age of 7, because we know that gender stereotyping, it settles in so young. There's books in the pipeline as well. There's a new teen magazine working with a partnership with Sunday Independent. Claire Hennessy is our editor, she's Penguin Ireland's editor, so brilliant, witty, intelligent young adult authors adapting biographies for an audience. Young teen audience. And then there's a series of events as well. So the Salon series started in Trinity College. In January, the students decided that the day of Trump's inauguration would be the perfect day to celebrate women. Great alchemy, great sense of humour. And then every month on the 20th day, a different university takes the baton and they host a Herstory Salon. So it's going all around the country. It's really fantastic. And I know next month it's going to be in UCD. It's Mary, isn't it? That's what we agreed before the summer holidays. Yeah. So yeah, so I'm going to talk about the Light Festival. This is just to show you, give you a feel for the teen magazine that we're working on. They're all women, bar one actually, Jocelyn Medward on the top left, but they're all historical women. So it just shows you can bring back to life. So, illuminate her story. I was meditating one day on a rainy, miserable day, and I thought, why not light up the world with women? Because we already do it on St. Patrick's Day. How powerful would that be? Because especially in public spaces, we don't see women. They're not represented, whether it's our street names, in statues. So how do we make them visible? And I know this is temporary, but it's very powerful, and it does go viral on social media as well, which is really important too, to raise the profile of women. So we did a grassroots test in January, and it just exploded. It was absolutely fascinating. The word went out 2 months before Christmas to county councils around the country. 198 women were celebrated, 16 counties illuminated, castles, museums, libraries, theatres, homes, offices. There was 44 participating organisations and loads of very much grassroots activity happening. What I found very interesting was where the engagement happened and why. The closer you got to Dublin, the lower the engagement. Dublin and the national government thought that the leaking side wall of an office block in the capital city was a fitting tribute to the women of Ireland. I hope they'll raise their game this year. Galway and Fermanagh lit up castles in comparison. I just thought that was absolutely fascinating. The engagement in Northern Ireland, nearly all 6 counties illuminated in the first year. The respect for women in Northern Ireland, palpable difference. I could actually see it in the email engagement. Men as much as women. And I talked to the director of museums and visitor experience in Derry City Council, and I asked her, why is this the case in Northern Ireland? Why is it so different? And she said it's not just because of the peace process. The women obviously play a pivotal role at a family level, community level, and a national level in their role in the peace process. In conflict zones, you'll find that women have to rise up to play a vital role. But it goes back further in history. She says that in the times before the plantations, the strongest tribes were in the north. And in those times, women were, the Brehon laws, the women had more power, and women were very vocal, and they were respected for their power too. So they've got centuries and centuries of very strong women. That was her theory anyway. It's just fascinating to I go to meetings in Dublin, we have to catch up with Northern Ireland, the perspectives there. It's very inspiring, Sorry. Hi. So trended number 2 on Twitter. There were 429,000 Twitter impressions. It just went bang. They're the participating counties. We lit up, this is a glacial erratic, it's not a building now. Very ambitious, barefaced rock. The technician said, don't get your hopes up. It worked out really well. 300 quid to hire that projector, and just the impact was absolutely stunning. It's Aylnaware on the Hill of Ishnock. It's the sacred feminine centre of Ireland. It's where legend has it, the goddess Eru, the founding goddess of Ireland, that's where she's buried. Beautiful, beautiful place. So it's very much about grassroots activation, bottom up, and everybody can get involved. So the beauty of it is you can light up landmarks, you can light up Parliament, you can light up museums, libraries, but also you can light up at home. And we know that in Ireland, in every boardroom, in every classroom, there are light projectors. They're everywhere. And for the students, student activists amongst you, here's a little bit of inspiration. The Wanda Film Festival in Belfast were very cheeky. Brilliantly cheeky. They had a great idea. You see, you actually don't have to get permission to light up on buildings, because you're just shining a torch once you don't hang around for too long. I didn't say that, right? So what they did was, they wanted to make a statement and they didn't have any funding. So they got the 2000 lumen, very low res strength of a projector. And they went around with a little portable generator. It cost them 50 quid. Laugh now, the BBC covered this, it was amazing. They went around and they projected iconic images of women from the film industry, lost, forgotten and contemporary, onto statues, iconic statues around the city. I thought, that's a brilliant way to make a statement as students, you know. Not particularly, they didn't project onto statues of men. I'm waiting for somebody to do that one yet, but just to show you, if you do want to get involved, this is very much a grassroots initiative and you can do it. A note on this particular project is very, very powerful. It's called the Skype Impossible Family Portrait. So this gentleman here is in his house in London, and this is his family back in Uganda. And this is live, real-time footage. They projected his family onto his living room wall in London, the Impossible Family Portrait. Every Sunday they have Sunday dinner together, thanks to Skype. So it's a beautiful way of connecting the diaspora around the world as well. So just to give you an idea of where we're at for this year, we're looking at getting 32 counties. It's probably going to happen. I hope it's not a case with the marriage equality referendum where Roscommon was the only county not to get on board. You know, I really feel for them. Every time we go to Roscommon, you really do. It breaks my heart. In terms of international engagement, there's already about 20 countries on board, all across the Middle East, the US, North Africa, Europe. Haven't talked to anybody in Australia yet. Looking to get Kenya, hopefully. As well. I presented at the Lynch Foundation. It's an amazing organisation, 43 countries working together on cross-collaborative projects, Middle East, North Africa and Europe, and the engagement was phenomenal. People are really captivated by the theme of light, because the women have been in the shadows, they've been in the darkness all along. And this universal theme of light is very empowering. We need to illuminate, we need to shed light, highlight our struggles, the inequality that's there, the injustice that's there, but also highlight the achievements too. It's very it's got a great alchemical, I suppose, power, light. So another bit of good news I received this week, Ogilvy and Mather, the advertising agency, have a Dublin base, and they're very supportive of Herstory. And they are sending out an open call to 173 cities, 450 offices worldwide to light up the buildings, because we know this is one of the greatest ironies of that little bit in the Constitution that states that the Irish woman's place is in the home. It's still there, by the way. By relegating us to the home, we become the most powerful consumers in the capitalist culture. We make 85% of purchasing decisions, so we can't really keep women down. It's kind of ironic, we still manage to rise up. So it's a wonderful opportunity for brands to say thank you to women and to light up buildings, their buildings in celebration. So like I said, we already light the world on St. Patrick's Day. Let's light the world with women. And it's a beautiful opportunity to showcase the architecture in the city that we have, the buildings that are there, and to profile female architects too. So I'm hoping you might get on board. So it's over 4 nights, and there's 4 themes, universal themes, that create quite a powerful narrative arc. We're going to lead with the rise of ancient heroines. I thought I knew all the mythological characters from Irish mythology, fairy tales, the books we get as children. There's loads more. Some of the best stories are missing. One of my particular favourites, she's not mythological, she's actually historical. Gormlaith. I know you're supposed to pronounce it like Gormlay, but she definitely was Gormlaith. 3 times High Queen of Ireland. Bribery was just one of her husbands. Way too powerful, had to be deleted from history. There's no way they could have kept her in there in the school books. What a woman. What a story, huh? This is the area rising up, an illustration of Jim Fitzpatrick. Rising up in Barron, actually. At the launch of Illuminate Herstory last year. So the second day, we're celebrating every woman, a democracy representation. A lot of people think that because we're lighting up castles, we have to light up with iconic women who've achieved, wonderful things. But what about when we're celebrating everyday women? And in Galway, in January, they lit up with... Sorry, sure, no problem. Yeah, I'm literally just talking about that. Okay, I'll move on. And then the next day, we're going to be celebrating a World of Equals, a theme, I suppose, inspired by the fact that in every extraordinary woman's biography, there was always one man who saw her as an equal, who helped her along the way. And often there's a cross-pollination between men and women that's not acknowledged in history. So we want to celebrate these great partnerships. Men and women, but also same-sex partnerships. I know from 1916 Rising, the women, the gay, lesbian women had a huge pivotal role to play, and they were the most rejected in the centenary celebrations. And then the fourth day, Voice of the Future, to get the children to rewrite the history books, to tell stories of women in their family, and moving forward to a world of equals. So that's me. Thank you, sorry.
Thanks, Melanie. Sorry to hurry you up, but just want to make sure we have time for discussion and questions. It was a really fantastic. I really enjoyed your presentation, but we did need to move on. And it's quite difficult to know how to start discussion after 4 such amazing but also really different presentations. And I think it's really interesting that between the speakers they've covered very practical aspects, historical, symbolic, mythological, perception of women, that all of these things are being discussed. And I think it would be good if we could try to touch on each of those to some extent. I think certain phrases people used really stuck out. I mean, obviously in Tara's case, talking about valuing your time, but then her quote, "She's great, but female, I prefer males," is, just we won't forget that one. I think Carole spoke very interestingly about, first of all, about this shift in membership in the Institute, but also about, to me, really important thing is why do women not stay in the profession? I would say that is one of the things we really have to try to understand. If 59% of graduate members are women and 25% of members altogether in the Institute are women, either things are moving in the right direction, which is probably partly true, but it also might just suggest that young women who recently graduated are working as architects, and as they go through their careers, as you said, only 5% of retired architects are women. So that's something we have to deal with. I think that the issues about history and symbolism, almost how our history symbolises our attitudes to women, and I suppose not just to women but to other disadvantaged or people who are perceived to not be powerful, is really important. And I think Mary's presentation about that is really interesting. I mean, everybody has a Magdalene Laundry story, I think. Melanie had one, you spoke about them. We did a project, actually had an image of the Good Shepherd Convent in Cork, and we were working for years on a project that eventually didn't happen for UCC to transform that Good Shepherd campus into a new campus for the university. But in our analysis, it's an enormous string of buildings on the hill, really visible in Cork, which they always did that, they built them in quite visible positions. But when we analysed this, I think it was 150 metres of unbroken building, we realised there was not one door visible on the front of the building. So the building was just symbolically saying you can't get in and you can't get out. And I mean, that was, and actually the whole, I mean, you talked about the bishop, the whole design of those buildings is really interestingly designed to be controlling and authoritarian. Now, but what's in a way almost more frightening is that now people are being put in buildings which are innocuous and don't express that so overtly. So maybe we have to be conscious also about our role in providing appropriate environments for people to live in. But I think, and what's exciting about Melanie's work is about this, I love this phrase, light up the world with women. And you also had to put, well, women are boring. And which I think is an attitude that's used a lot to suppress women. Anne Wright wrote in the London Review of Books recently about a woman author who had submitted her novels to hundreds of publishing houses and got a really small response, and she's so frustrated she sent the same novel in using a man's name, and she got a 75% increase in people writing back saying, I'd like to see more, I'd like to work more. So I think we have to deal with things from perception and mythology and image, but maybe also I think we as a group have to think about why do women leave, how can we change that, and maybe I'd like to start by asking Carole if she has any advice on how we might work to keep women working in architecture in whatever way they would or could.
Yeah, I think we have to be more feisty, and I think that there's a perception there of, particularly registration, and that's a whole other discussion, and I know it's very complicated, but people think, oh, I'm not on a register of architects, therefore I can't call myself an architect, and therefore I'm not going to really be an architect. And that's not really the way it is, because you can in the RIAI, if you do your professional practice exam when you become registered and then decide for whatever reason that you need to take a career break, because let's face it, this isn't just among women architects, this is women all over the place. Women may need to take a career break to have children, to mind a sick relative because they want to go into further education, or they want to, for various different reasons, as do men. I mean, it's not just, but men seem to have more self-confidence about it, and from my point of view, a personal point of view. So in the RIAI, if you have passed your professional practice exam and you are on the register, but you need to take some time off for your career, or out of your career to do other things, you just need to let the RIAI know and they'll let you back in. Whereas people think that once you're off the register you can never get back to it, or it's going to cost you a fortune, or you have to do all this CPD or whatever. So I think, and I'm I'm campaigning for that within the RIAI at the moment. I was speaking to Sandra Campbell about that, and I have information here from her about it and stuff. It's not really relevant for most of you in the room at this stage, but it is an important part. So the Institute has its part to play, but I do believe we also have a part to play. And I think establishing networks, women are not good at networking. We really aren't. And I think networking is the way to stay in it, because every time my career, as I say, has gone down so many different paths, and I'm not alone in that by any means, so there's lots of like that, but by having a network around me all the time and making sure I had a network, every time a door closed down one direction for me, I was able to turn around and look, and look down another direction, because I network with people, and I would talk to people and find out what was going on, and that has, and I think that's really important thing, and we our own network as well as our multidisciplinary network.
But I mean, my perception, I did a talk with the women in architecture in the AJA organised thing, and looking into figures then and talking to them about it, is that architecture is worse than law and medicine, for example, in terms of the number of women practicing. And I would say the perception, and women doctors, that fight has been won. Probably there's more women doctors than men doctors, especially at GP level, which is where most people maybe first encounter women. And women lawyers as well. And I just wonder if the sort of work that Melanie and Mary are doing, which is two different ways of thinking about perception of women generally in society, is there any way that the women in architecture could use either your sort of disseminating, projecting women specifically to try to just change people's understanding of an architect could just as well be a woman as a man? And I suppose that the historical research that Mary is doing, I mean, I think it was Carole actually talked about value your intellect, and Tara talked about women working in history and research that their texts aren't being put on reading lists. That those are, I mean, I'd just be interested to know if you two were to focus your particular areas of interest onto the subject of women practicing as architects in Ireland in the 21st century, is there any way you think that your work could help just that perception for it to be seen as normal, that a woman, that an architect is just as likely to be a woman as a man?
Well, I think in any profession that women are entering, and we have had to enter all the professions, women were excluded from them. In lots of ways, you have to normalise what it means to be an architect, so that we're not saying a woman architect and an architect. Because we use the term architect, we know what it means, it's a man. If we use woman doctor, woman solicitor, woman barrister, woman female historian sometimes, you get called. You'd have to normalise it, that it's gender neutral. But also it's about putting women's work on the syllabus. Normalising it for students, that they're reading about women, that they're reading the work that women have done. That confidence is grown among the students, so that there is more retention within the profession as well. And all of those things add up, but certainly getting rid of unconscious bias as well. I mean, I read what Tara mentioned, the article that you mentioned that came out the other day about this unconscious bias about teachers in academia, that women will always get worse student responses and all that sort of thing. We need to sort of normalise it, that we have a gender neutral teaching space in which students and teachers are learning about a subject. It doesn't matter who's giving you the information, as long as they're good or bad, their gender shouldn't come into it. But also normalising it to be, and creating also a system within a profession where taking time off for maternity leave, sick care, elder care is actually becomes part and parcel of the system itself. And it doesn't actually mean that you end up way behind everybody else in your cohort and your peer group, or you feel like you can't come back in. There should be systems in place that make it the transition from being on maternity leave or whatever leave you're taking to coming back in, because it's mostly women who are taking those leave. Some professions have done that quite well. I think maybe look to those models and see how you can use those models that are already there. There's no need to reinvent the wheel in lots of ways, because it has been done successfully.
I'd just like to bring the audience in at this stage, and we might come back to Melanie maybe at the end, telling us how you can help us to change the perception of our professions. I just wonder if any students or staff or anyone else in the audience has a question or a comment.
Maybe I'll start. I think I don't know, the talk was so much better, I guess, than I had anticipated. I didn't really know what you were going to talk about. But for me, there are sort of two linked themes that come up. The idea of something that's self-perpetuating and unconscious is perhaps why I've wanted to do this, because I feel like you need to act upon that. So the idea of normalising stuff, it had always been presumed to myself that equality existed, so I didn't need to do anything, I just needed to continue. But actually you need to be active, you need to actively normalise something, and as someone was saying earlier, you need to keep doing it. So it's not just doing something once or presuming that we got the vote in whatever the various years were across the UK and Ireland, and so now we're all equal. We need to actively do things like this all the time. So I think the idea of being conscious of this and then acting upon it, and then hopefully this awareness will then make people make small changes in everything they do, whether it's something like organising something like this, or just or going out of your way to try and reference a female architect in a precedent study, or taking out more books written by and reading, and also teachers. So as Sheila isn't here anymore, but the idea of an action that we could do is also put things in the curriculum more. So yeah, mine's not really a question, it's more of a point.
Can I just follow up on that point though, what you're saying? I was talking to students in Trinity after Trump got into power, and they said to me, they broke down in tears. They met together in the different societies, and they were so upset. They feel so disengaged and so disempowered in a lot of ways and get so active. And I think it's really important for your generation of students to feel empowered at the moment because of what's happening around the world. You know, you're graduating into chaos, really, you know. But to find that, I suppose, in New World Orders, there are opportunities there to change, to break down these structures and systems. We're much more aware of them now. The Women's Marches in January, a brilliant example of women working together, empowering each other. That's never ever happened before, ever in history. 60 countries, simultaneously women, millions of women all around the world, and men rising up with them. So the patriarchal power system is like this, it's like a pyramid, yeah? But women, we're really good at, when we're really, really genuinely empowered, we do synergy, we pass the baton really fast, and we look out for each other. And that, when we take down the patriarchal power systems and we start looking out for each other and working together more cohesively in the workplace, in the professional space, not just in the homework community, we can shift things very fast. And that's how I'm working with Herstory, to try and find ways to pass the baton to the students, take the baton to the salons, you know? It's really important that you don't feel disempowered. And I suppose Waking the Feminist is another great example. That started with one tweet. You know, don't underestimate your voice, especially with social media.
But I think it's also...
Well, actually, adding to that, I think we also have to realise that the responses, in lots of ways, from the right, which is about pushing back at women's achievements and women's rights that have been gained over the years, really comes from an idea that those who have privilege see equality as a loss, rather than sharing the space. So, for women, and it's across the board, gender and class and race, and that's why I would say intersectional feminism is really the way of responding to modern societal concerns. We have to normalise equality, the concept of equality. What do we mean by equality? do we mean that men are losing certain privileges and certain positions within society? We don't. We mean it's opening up that shared space where men and women can have equal access to education, equal access to the workplace, no gender pay gap, that paternity and maternity leave should be considered similarly. And it shouldn't be that paternity leave is sort of an add-on or an adjunct to that, and most men don't take it. There was a journal article during the week that most men don't take up on paternity leave because they see it as a threat to their position within their profession. You know, welcome to women's world. So normalising the concept of equality is a very necessary thing as well, and seeing equality not as a threat, but something that actually benefits both men and women and benefits the totality of society.
Yeah. I mean, I think that we should also be optimistic as a gender in this profession in Ireland, and maybe one of the things of being a really small country where there's a really small community is that little things make a big difference. And I mean, Carole was saying earlier, not everybody's going to be Grafton architects or whatever, but I think the fact that if you turn on the radio in Ireland and there's somebody talking to an architect or the television, is at least as likely that will be a woman as a man in the current position, because women have very high profile. International perception of Irish architecture would involve every practice that's known outside of Ireland has at least one woman as, you know, as partner or director. So I think that's really important for you as a generation to start with that assumption, that in terms of when thinking about Melanie's thing about projecting stuff, start with the assumption that's the way it can be. But then, of course, what we have to deal with are these practical things, which are really important about, and I think they're, as you just said, Mary, male and female things, because in the end, if men would admit it, it would be so much better for them if they could take paternity leave. If they could, I mean, their lives would be enhanced greatly if they would accept that actually, if they're a parent, it's just as interesting to be a father as a mother, it's just as important. So probably male and females got to work together in your generation to bring about this change that allows people to have lives in parallel with careers.
I think it's also important that we advocate for each other. And not to the exclusion of our male colleagues, but I do think that women aren't very good at promoting each other. I think there's a kind of, I don't know, it's a kind of a competitive streak, the kind of a negative competitiveness or something. And it happens when we're in school. We all come across it in school, and particularly if you go to an old girls' school and then you go to college, and then as you go on into the workplace. And I don't think we're very good at mentoring each other. So, you know, older women in practice, maybe there's not enough older women in practice to have enough time physically to be doing that, but I do think that that's something that we need to build on and that we need to celebrate. And I just, you know, in response to what Melanie is saying and about the event she's organising and everything, that the event that we had in July in the RIAI to celebrate International Women in Architecture Day is the most successful event the RIAI has ever run in its history of 178 years. In that it booked out in 1 hour. It's the only time ever an event is booked out in 1 hour. We had a waiting list of 80 people. So there is a demand there to run these type of events, and you know what Chloe was doing today is great. And you know, you were saying you're speaking at the AJ thing, Women in Architecture, and all these events. I mean, we don't want to gild the lily, but we need to keep it. We need to keep it in the common parlance and the conversation of what's going on, and we need to support each other and organise these events. Make it fun. You know, it's not all serious, but it's fun and it's support and it's you know, encouragement.
So Finola, can you spend a minute?
The key statistic I would take away from today is the one female partner in the 5 largest firms in the country out of approximately 1,000.
I've got that wrong, it's not 1,000, that was me being a bit ambitious, but it's certainly several hundred. Yeah.
But I was wondering, in the AA, when I was there 20 years ago, Elizabeth Lebas did some research in collaboration with the RIAI as to those key statistics, as to how many women are in what roles in the largest practices that build most of the buildings in the country. And I think the RIAI should actually help maybe a university to do that research so that there are hard statistics for all of us who have been in the profession, know that the statistics are probably really shocking. Yeah. And we need to get it into the media so that people realise, and so also that girls who are choosing this profession are aware of what they're going into. Because it's really terrible how many people of my generation, for example, are not on any of those partner boards or anything like that. Yeah.
And I'm concerned that we don't actually have the data to make the case, either in the Institute, and people within the Institute are certainly colluding with some of this, or in the public sector. Because the practices themselves are allowing it to happen.
But the RIAI doesn't tell a practice how to run its business. How can the RIAI tell a practice
No,
how
you
to run
can't
its
tell them
business?
how to run a business, but it's
I'm
acceptable.
sorry, first of all, the data is there. If anybody wants to come into the RIAI, speak to Sharon Maguire, she collects all the data on membership. It's all there. So we have a practice membership, and practice members fill out the number of people in a practice. If the male-female question isn't there, we can certainly, if somebody wants, we can put it on the questionnaire. We're there, the RIAI is there to facilitate all the membership. We don't collude with practice. We're not the RIAI is not an obscure or we're not that type of an organisation at all. We're trying to help all our members. That's why we established student membership. That's why we established graduate membership. That's why we had International Women Architecture Day this year. That's why we're doing all these things. And I have all the statistics here in terms of the membership categories. You can have a look at them if you want, and I can get more information for you. But it's up to the practices themselves how they run each other. And I think the reason that there are not women at partnership level in the big practices is because of the fact that women take time out mostly during their career. The woman I know who is a partner in one of the big practices doesn't have children, and that I think that is it's not a conspiracy. It's just the way life works.
But I think Fionnola's point is a good one, that it should be. I mean, I'm just thinking, if Melanie was to project this information on, big buildings or something, I think it is information that could be summarised into a very short thing. And it's interesting that probably in small practices, lots of women are directors. So even that,
Absolutely, yeah.
What's the difference? In a way, there isn't a difference, except that there's a hierarchy, and there's an existing, perhaps they're old practices run by men. There's an existing male hierarchy within those practices. And I know the HA survey is exactly the same as big practices in prison.
It's the same way in
very
education.
few.
It's the same situation in education as well. Lots of women teach, but there's very few of us who are
Yeah.
senior levels. I mean, and our school is a really bad example of that.
Sorry, can I add into that? Just to kind of throw a little suggestion out there that may or may not go down well. I'm a firm believer in gender quotas. I believe gender quotas should be instituted in public and private institutions, because without gender quotas we're actually not going to get the representation we need on boards, at senior partnership level, in politics, all that sort of thing. I think gender quotas work. They can be instituted for a certain amount of time. We saw what happened in the last general election, and that was just gender quotas at selection of candidates to run in the general election, and it increased the number from 16%, I think, to 22 or 3% representation. Still pretty pathetic when you consider that women are 50% of the population. We should have 50% representation. I think without voices and representation at senior level, as we know, I know, and those of us who teach in universities know, you're not going to get the promotion of women. Here in UCD, as in most universities, those who are at the junior lectureship level, the majority of them are women. Those who are on precarious contracts, the majority of them are women. As you climb that system, the percentage of women goes down and down and down until at the very top, as Tara said, we haven't had a woman president or provost in 450 years, which was when Trinity was founded, and yesterday they were celebrating their 25th anniversary, and they tweeted about it, and I subtweeted saying that's great because it's my alma mater, so I said congrats, but I said I hope we see a woman provost before the 450th. I don't know if that's going to happen, but for example, if you tie having women on boards to money or to quotas, it actually works. So now with Athena Swan in the universities, we're beginning to see a little bit of a sea change in attitudes to promotion of women. And because that's tied with research funding, things will have to change. It can't be lip service anymore. So I think, whatever about the softly approach, I'm a firm believer in the hardball approach, gender quotas, enforce them, put them in place. As somebody who's been campaigning for equal rights all of my adult life, I'm sick of asking for it. At this stage, I want it. I demand it.
So we're running relatively short in time. I see Mark Price wants to make a contribution.
Carole has, you're the only, I could be wrong, you're the first president who has mentioned pay conditions for graduates. I could be wrong about this. You've been researching it. There was, I think, a bit of research done before that was kind of left on hold. I think this is the root, this is one of the roots of sexism in the profession. It's completely tied up with the idea that somehow or other labour is, virtue is its own reward, because that's a class position. And are you going to, keep going with this, I hope, and after your presidency, to continue this kind of stuff? Because I notwithstanding your spirited defence of the Institute, I think that they haven't been good on this materialist problem, which is sexist as well as to do with the class bias of the profession at the same time.
But I'd have to say it's not just sexist, it is to do with all young architects are underpaid, but again, Carole, before your time, I have very strongly spoken out at a lot of Institute conferences in the last 10 years about fees, and architects' fees have dropped so much in recent years, and frankly the Institute has not really supported very much in the before your time, Carole. And architects are so underpaid that it drives this ridiculous situation that their employees are underpaid, and it's a kind of perpetuating circle. And only the people who have very big practices, who do very big work and repeat the work they do almost exactly, can afford to pay people proper salaries. If an architect is putting work into what they're doing, the fees have become so low and the norm has been so low. And I mean, the problem is that there are no fee scales anymore. But I think if we're talking about pay, we have to go back to how much architects' work is valued by clients, and maybe that's a campaign that also needs to happen to make clients realise if you want to get something decent, you've got to pay for it, and you'll get what you pay for, which nowadays it's become really difficult to work in this country because of that. And I think that is an issue for men and women, but I think a lot of the issues are for men and women. I think the one about parental leave, about how to have a life, how to have a family, is something that young male and female students and architects need to work together on, because it isn't, and actually there are benefits for both, and that's what I said before. The thing, that life where a man doesn't take his leave because he doesn't want his bosses to think he's some kind of Skyver offer, is your generation can change that by saying, well, actually, sorry, I have a child and I want to spend time with him or her. I would say that issues have been raised here which need to be addressed, and I think Chloe has started something great, and I would like to think that maybe there'll be further events in school, and maybe even we could try to identify different subject matters, because some of them are really practical, like how do we get proper working conditions, but then it comes into how do we change the perception, how are women seen generally in society, how are women seen in our profession, and it would be great to have that conversation go on.
I would happily do a workshop here with students on unemployment. There's no problem about that.
That would be really good.
Yeah. Can I just say, just to refer back to Magdalene in my little presentation about when I talked about William K. Parry back in 1917 and his speaking to his brother architects and all the rest of it. The profession of architecture was a gentlemanly profession, and Vaughan at the launch of Arthur Gibney's book last week in the RIAI, she just told a little story about Arthur Gibney. I presume most of you know of Arthur Gibney. Anyway, when Arthur came from a relatively ordinary background in Dublin, and he went to Bolton Street to study architecture. And when he was interviewed for the place there, he was asked, was he a man of means? And that wasn't to pay his college fees, that was to support his career, because architects got paid so little money, because architects generally came from families of means. Yeah. And my big reasoning behind all of this is I don't come from a family of means. I'm the first Pollard to go to third level education. And most people who study architecture now are like me, not like William K. Parry. So we have to earn our living this way. This is why we're studying architecture. We're not studying it for some kind of indulgence. We're studying it to earn a living. And that's where I'm trying to get to for men, women, everybody. That's really what it's all about. So we can do some more work on that. I think we should lift it up for everybody. Yeah.
And we might ask other people to pick up the baton, especially since Chloe's in 5th year. We really need some 1st and 2nd years to start this thing, to join with her. So maybe there should be some kind of workshop in the school that gets students in different years involved in continuing this discussion. And it may indeed spread into women and men in architecture, but let's start with women because, as Mary said, maybe we just do need to demand and get things going. So we have gone over our time, so I'd like to thank all the speakers who were really